Happy Tuesday, everyone. Hello, hello. My name is Jacob Kirksey. I'm an assistant professor here in the College of Education in the Educational Leadership Policy Program. I am so excited that you all have decided to join us today for our third policy brown bag, where we are hosting Professor David Baker from Pennsylvania State University. But before we get to today's talk, I thought I would just give you a little bit of an overview of our series and then turn it over to Dr. Mendez, the Dean of the College of Education here at Texas Tech, to share a few words. If this is your first brown bag, welcome. This is really exciting. We're glad to have you. This virtual series really was started as an effort from the Educational Leadership Policy faculty to just kind of take advantage of what we already kind of were experiencing, much of a virtual world, and use this as a platform to cross-pollinate research ideas, both from some of us at Texas Tech, but then also others like our speaker today at other institutions, just like you would typically see at a brown bag. Though, of course, I can't just send you lunch, though I have heard people talk about, sending Postmates gift cards to students or brown bag participants. That seems like a cool idea. But anyway, so thanks again for joining. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Jesse Mendez just to just say a few words. Thanks for joining us, Jesse.
No, anytime. As far as just wanted to, on behalf of the College of Education, just wanted to welcome each and every one of you, including Dr. Baker, to the campus of Texas Tech University. Behind me, you see Jones Stadium, which is usually filled on every Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. And so wish you were here with us, but this is the next best thing. And you're in good hands with Dr. Kirksey and Dr. Baker. So hope you guys enjoy this session.
Thank you,
Thanks
Dean.
so much. What a view.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, so now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Alexander Wiseman, also here in the Educational Leadership Policy Program, to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kirksey. I think I know most of you, and I appreciate the introduction. I am a professor here in our Educational Leadership Policy Program, and very excited to have David Baker talking to us today, and I'd like to introduce him. So let me tell you a little bit about Dave's background first, and then we'll turn it over to him for the talk. David Baker earned a PhD in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University, and he's currently professor of education and sociology at Penn State University. He publishes widely about how education as a robust social institution transforms global society, which includes interdisciplinary research on formal education's impact on health, social, and economic development in many regions of the world. He's directed an international team examining the development of the research university and its influence on science productivity over the 20th century, which was funded by the Qatar National Research Foundation. And he's also undertaken education policy analysis in many different regions, most recently in the Andean region of Peru and in sub-Saharan Africa. He's consulted on education development with national governments. He's undertaken educational policy analysis for multilateral agencies like UNESCO, OECD, and the World Bank. And he's the senior author of the OECD's report, Green at 15, Environmental and Geoscience Literacy Among 15-Year-Olds in PISA 2006. Dr. Baker's been the U.S. Senior Fulbright Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Germany and a Fulbright New Century Scholar on the future of the university in the 21st century. His TED Talk, which is titled New Minds, Gods, and Political Upheavals, Imagining a New World from the Education Revolution, has garnered more than 41,000 views. His works have garnered numerous awards as well, including the AERA Outstanding Book Award for his book, The Schooled Society, The Educational Transformation of Global Culture, published by Stanford University Press, as well as the award for significant research from the Association for the Study of Higher Education for his book, The Century of Science, The Global Triumph of the Research University, published by Emerald. Now, I will also add that Dave Baker was my doctoral advisor and my dissertation chair when I was just a young grad student at Penn State. And I'm genuinely and truly honored to say that he's also my friend and my colleague. And that my life, and this is where I'm going to get sappy on you, Dave, My life and my career are truly better than they ever could or would have been without your careful guidance, expert mentoring, and continued scholarly engagement, literally for decades. And I really appreciate it. So I'm a little biased, as you can tell in my intro. But today, I think we're all going to get a little bit of Dave's influence and hopefully feel some of the impact of his ideas. He's here to talk to us about the globalization of universities and science, and he might just use the term mega science along the way. Thanks, Dave. It's all yours now.
Thank you, Alex, for that wonderful introduction. And yes, I can return all those sappy feelings about you as well. You've been a great colleague. Thank you, Jacob, and thank you to your dean. Yeah, I think you guys will have to owe me 2 real trips after this, and I'll talk again. Anyway, it's great to be here with all of you at Texas Tech. You actually are part of the story at Texas Tech I'm going to come to here in a moment. And it's an interesting part of the story. So Alex, if you can go to the first slide, that would be great. So what is mega science? Alex was teasing about this word. We thought about it a long time. It's bigger science than we ever imagined is what mega science is. So as you kind of heard a little bit about my background, what I'm interested in is what happens when human societies get very educated. We often think about education, and I know in colleges of ed, we're trying to make the best education product we can, all good things, but increasingly, the education system as an institution is worldwide, and it's massive, and it changes people. And I have to say, my brethren and sistren sociologists have not thought about that as much as they should. Democracy, capitalism, inequality, and so forth, these get all of the major play. But the education revolution, which I'll come to in a bit, has had massive effects on individuals and then on societies. One of those that I wanted to show was what has it done to science? Science is a core part of world society, and it's done quite a lot. So what is mega science? So mega science is science to great proportions. This is a slide here of a team of 300 astrophysicists, physicists, and engineers, all working together in real time. They have a lab set up in Antarctica. When these special particles called neutrinos, I won't go into it, hit the ice, they leave little puffs of light. When they're discovered by the team in Antarctica, the coordinates go out to other universities and institutions. They track where the light came from, and so forth. And a few years ago, they really had a major breakthrough and found evidence of this a central particle that had been theorized to be there, but nobody could find. This increasingly is what science is about. Not always this big and this dramatic, and not always with a lab in Antarctica, but big collaboration, significant collaboration. And the funny thing is that this wasn't supposed to happen. But if you go to the next slide for me, I'll show you some of the dimensions. So this is an estimate of the annual number of articles, papers, scientists call them, where they publish their discoveries, big, small, and in between. And most of you know about paper publishing. There's a similar thing in education and social sciences. These are STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, math, and the plus is for health and medical. So this is all the sciences publishing in just 1 year. So in 1900, there were 10,000. Not a insignificant number, by the way, but 10,000 is about what an American research university publishes in 1 year now. It's gone up to the latest figures, 3 million articles were published in 2019. That gives you an indication of how much science is going on. If you go to the next slide, please. We also see that science is spreading everywhere. These are the numbers of countries where there were papers coming from in that particular year. And we've gone up to about 206, is probably even more now. That was from 2010. That's when our data stopped. So this has become a very global process. Next one, please. You can also see the expansion in the number of journals. Now, that's important. Why? Because it's an indicator of scientific topics. New topics come along, new journals come along. New topics deepen, more journals are done in that area. So we see an explosion in the number of topics, which means more and more things are scientized. If you go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned early, this is also about collaboration. This is one of the big things that has been happening. More people working with more people across the world on all kinds of science. That's important because just a while back, a lot of people didn't think science could expand. If you go to the next slide, please. And, oh, there it is. Okay, so this is, maybe most of you don't know Professor Price, but he wrote a book called Little Science, Big Science and Beyond. And unfortunately, he passed away about a year before the book came out. It was a big hit. And the book argued that we were going to run out of capacity to do science, that science had expanded as much as it possibly could, and it was going to stop. If you go on to the next slide, please. Well, clearly he was wrong. And unfortunately, he didn't get to see his heir and recover from it. Why was he wrong? Well, there's two reasons. Go to the next slide, please. First of all, as I already noted, more and more people in more and more places get involved with science. And the next slide. And so oftentimes you hear in the media about Chinese science is catching up with American science. It has. American science has been dominant over the past century. It has. But the slide here shows you how much science, the proportion of the total number of papers, and keep in mind that they're really exploding the number of papers, is done by different regions of the world. And what this tells you is that there's greater and greater parity. Yes, the United States and Canada still produce a lot, but Europe has been producing a lot. Asian countries have been producing a lot, and all other countries besides the three areas have been producing a lot. So what Price missed was this worldwide capacity to do science in a way that he never guessed would happen. Go to the next slide, please. So the second reason is the one that we've been investigating. What provided the platform? How did the world pay for this kind of science? So many science watchers, and Price wasn't the only one, he was the most significant and noted. Many people said in around 1970, 1980, oh, this can't go any further. It's going to get too expensive. It just can't be done. And we put together a team here from all over the world. Alex mentioned we got money from Qatar, which is very interesting. I can talk about that later. And we asked the question of, gee, what role have universities played? And more profoundly, what role has the expansion of education played over the 19th century to support science? And these two topics are not often thought about together. Even though everybody knows, you've been on university campus, there are scientists and people publish papers like crazy. We all know that, but we don't think much about the relationship of why that's there and why it's expanded and why it's gone worldwide. So if you could do the next slide, please, that'd be great. So we got a lot of research money from Qatar because they have decided, or they did decide about 10 years ago, that they wanted to have research universities, and they made arrangements with about 8 American research universities to come to Qatar and set up campuses. And so they wanted to study that. So we said we would, and we sent 2, be careful who you work for. We sent 2 graduate students to live for a year in Qatar. That was after Alex's time, or he very well could have been one. And they live well. but they did a lot of work. And what they did was from 1900 to 2010, they coded, and we also got some data now from Scopus and Web of Science, if you know those. We coded a selection of journals, and we basically were interested in the who, what, and where. And so that's an example of one of the papers that we coded, and we took down the names, we took down where they were, we took down the year and what journal and so forth. And we collected about 3 million papers, not all by hand, but we have a record of sort of the main STEM publications from 1900 to 2010, about every 5 years. Okay, so what did we find? If you go to the next slide, please. So here's our hypothesis, all right? So that make a global science is made possible, has been made possible by a commingling of a culture of higher education and a culture of science, okay? That thing going around there is a sciencey thing. Maybe one of you know actually what it is. I don't. I think it's molecule or something. The thing right below it is the new science building at Penn State University. It's very proud of this. All universities have these massive science complexes where there are hundreds of scientists doing thousands of papers every year. Okay, if you go to the next one, please. Alex, let's see if we can hit it. Okay. Oh, no, up. Oh, gave away the answer. Go back up. All right, here's a quick quiz for all of you. You just saw the answer. What U.S. university went from a small technical college in 1923 to a major research university by 2010? Well, go to the next slide. Well, it's yours, Texas Tech, okay? Why is that interesting? It's interesting because it shows several things. First, it shows this movement of colleges, all kinds of post-secondary institutions towards a institution that integrates research, knowledge production, not just science, all kinds of knowledge production, and teaching. And this was all funded or cross-subsidized, as the economists like to say, by a massive growth in post-secondary education. And this didn't only happen at Texas Tech or in the United States, but it's happened all over the world from 1900 on, in one region after another. So I argue that it's this process, the Texas Techs of the world, as much as the Harvards, Michigans, MITs, which get all of the media coverage, that has produced not only America's contribution to mega science, but the same around the world. So Texas Tech does absolutely everything all those other universities do, absolutely everything Penn State does. And this has been a major platform for science. Okay, if you go to the next one, please. Okay, so this is our hypothesis, and could we show that? All right, next one, please. And these are a couple people that, if you're a sociologist, you know who they are. That's not so important, but the people have been talking for a long time about what does the education revolution do? The education revolution is interesting. It's a combination of several things. It's at the bare minimum and the obvious, it's that people go for school longer and more people go. And that's been happening worldwide, at least since 1900, if not somewhat before. And we've gone into a very maturing phase of that, where the expansion of secondary, upper secondary, and then post-secondary is happening most places in the world. The second big thing, and actually in many ways the more primary thing, is that that's supported by a lot of cultural change in the ideas about education. That education shouldn't just be for the elite. That education shouldn't just be pigeonholed to certain vocational outcomes. That education should be about human development, on and on and on. I wrote a book a few years ago called The School Society, where I lay out a lot of those arguments. They all come down to the motivation that education is a human right, that education expansion is generally a good thing, and that there's really no stopping it at this point. So we argue that a major consequence of that educational revolution was the world's ability to do mega science. Okay, if you go on to the next slide, please. All right, so if you've read anything about what causes science, you're going to say, this guy's crazy. What do you mean? We know what causes science. And if you know the Warren Zevon song, Send Lawyers, Guns, and Money, that pretty much sums up what most people think causes science, right? The state, issues around warfare or trips to the moon, and of course, money. And it does include all of those. Our team's not saying that these are irrelevant. They aren't irrelevant. But when you look at it from a world perspective, it's much more than that. And these factors are important, but they're not the necessary underlying platform. What is, we argue, if you go to the next slide, please, has been the university. So I told you about that huge data set we have. When we calculate where those papers are from, they are from scientists working at universities, and that proportion has steadily gone up. We're probably not as confident in the early part estimates. There's probably a lot of noise there, but we get much more confident as the century goes on. And right now, about 80 to 85% of all those 3 million STEM articles include at least one university scientist, and most include multiple ones, and the majority include only university scientists. Now, papers aren't the only indicator of science production. There are other kinds of things, but it's a pretty good indicator of what's going on. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. So the book I'm doing with Justin Powell on all this right now, tries to trace the history of these ideas that I was talking about, both the education revolution and then more specifically, the idea of merging science in universities. And those of you who know something about the history of universities are a very old institution, the Western version, about 800 years old. They did not start with the idea that the faculty would produce science. While the faculty did do some early, what could roughly be called new knowledge production, by and large, that's not what they were doing. It wasn't until the 19th century that the idea of merging teaching, knowledge production, and bringing science into the university was very much considered. And it was growing Central Europe, particularly in Germany. And this guy named Humboldt, who the National University in Germany is named after, is in Berlin. There were a set of ideas. It turns out he didn't develop all those ideas. In fact, he didn't develop most of them, but it's been called after him anyway. But you see some of the ideas there. And these are new ideas. Now, this was not a committee of people that got together and said, hey, let's have these 4 new ideas. This was not, done just at one university. This was not done perfectly every time. There were lots of pushback. But this is generally the history of the ideas that were behind the research university. If you could go to the next slide, please. And we renamed it, we argue it's a university science cultural model. The idea that universities are a major place where science should be done. That seems natural now when you look at research, a university like Texas Tech or Penn State or anyone around the world, but it wasn't. It wasn't before about 1900, it was not the case. And this is intensified over time and become more what sociologists say normative. It becomes more normal. This is the way universities think of themselves and the way people who work at them think of themselves. Okay, if you could go to the next slide, it'd be great. So how does this work? Well, this is very clear at American universities, increasingly others, and your dean would totally recognize this. This is the the data I took was for the College of Science at Penn State. And what's important here is you see at the very top there, those 421 professors, you could call them scientists. They are all scientists in this college. And they are the ones that are the main producers and senior guides behind the papers and behind getting research grants to do the money and so forth. Note what supports them. There's another 934 postdoc, grad students, and other researchers that help them, very important. So together, that 1,300 person science institute would be one of the larger standing institutes in the world. But it's just one college at Penn State, and it's one of 8 colleges at Penn State that produce STEM papers. It's going to be the same at Texas Tech. They have slightly different names of colleges and so forth, but it's the same model. No, they're supported there by about 4,600 undergraduate majors in science. And then not only them, but other students all take science courses, right? We all know that faculty, most mainline faculty do not teach all the time. They teach roughly a fourth of their time. Sometimes less, sometimes a little more. And what do they do with the rest of their time? They do research, a little administration here and there, but they do research. So in a sense, what happens here is that undergrad and course taking cross-subsidize science. And this is the model based on these ideals from a long time ago that gets replicated in university after university. And if you follow the history of Texas Tech, this is exactly what it did. Okay, let's go to the next one. I think I just said that, so let's skip the next one. All right, so we in the book, we trace these cultural ideas and their organizational implementation. Now, this is a gravity of science, and it doesn't mean that most science is done in the middle of the ocean. What it means is if you take all the papers and assign them to the areas in the world, keep the oceans in place. This shows where the main gravity, the main center of that activity is happening. And the importance of this line is coupled. There are a couple important things. First of all, already by 1900, the center of gravity was moving away from Europe towards the United States. Interestingly, just before the war, 1940, it's a little block there, 1940, it started to turn again. Now, the United States was a huge producer of research, well, even till now. But what was happening is that the rest of the world was coming back online. Europe was quite decimated, particularly Germany and France and England, big science producers from the Second World War. They were starting to come back online. By the 1950s, it was moving back towards Europe and beyond Europe. Where was it going? It was going because Asian countries were and their universities were starting to produce large amounts of research. And those two little lines, a blue one and a green one there, indicate that if we took essentially the Asian production out of the equation, it would have gone down towards other parts of the world. In other words, as I showed you earlier, the whole world was becoming part of science. So the center of gravity has moved substantially. But we trace that line essentially, what I just said, and follow some of the ideas of that. So if you could go to the next one, that'd be great. Okay, so as I said, these ideas all started by and large in Central European universities, German-speaking universities. For example, the seminar, which you guys all know. What is the seminar? How is it different from a lecture? Well, you get together with a senior faculty member or a faculty member, sometimes several. It has graduate students at different levels. And you talk about ideas, you talk about research. It's a much more of a two-way discussion at different levels of experience with research or the particular science you're doing. This was invented right around 1900, a little bit before. By the way, University of Michigan was the first American university to actually say, let's use that. Because it gave a new perspective. It was, oh, I see. That's how that guy does research. I see. Okay. hey, I got an idea, let me put it out. And then a more senior person say, yeah, okay, but it's going to take this to make that happen, et cetera, right? That was a huge pedagogical research breakthrough. If you go to the next slide, please. So if a vice president from Texas Tech, vice president for research from Texas Tech was time traveled back to the late 19th century at University of Berlin, that's now Humboldt, Göttingen, any number of universities, he or she would say, oh yeah, I see what's going on here. They're doing research and they're teaching, and the two cross-subsidize each other. I get it. If they were transported another, say, 50 to 100 years back to the classical university, they would say, oh, this is a strange place for what I'm interested in. There's not much serious research going on. And it's not just technical breakthroughs. That's what I want. It's a sociological and organizational breakthrough. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. So this just gives you some of the nitty gritty of what's happening in Germany and the US. These are the most productive universities in 1900, and then every 10 years after to 1930. And what you see there are a lot of German universities. There's a few non-university institutions. I can talk about that later. And increasingly you get American institutions, but this is what was driving the paper production at the time. And that's basically is the same model that spreads to the United States than elsewhere. Okay, let's go to the next one. So the United States really expanded enrollment. As I said, you saw with Texas Tech, it went from a small college to now it has 40,000 some students at it. This has been a massive growth in the proportion of people doing undergraduate post-secondary training. And then along with it, the United States and now country after country has used that to create research universities. And so the bottom dark ribbon there are the most elite, the biggest. Texas Tech is now in there, 2016. But other universities also do research, just not as much of it. But when we're considering the total amount of production, they're important. So you go from really just a couple dozen major research universities to about 300 now are contributing on a regular basis. You want to go to the next slide, please? It's also not only just universities that now contribute, but all kinds of post-secondary institutions are contributing science research. Universities that hadn't done research, it had just mostly masters, now do it. Colleges do it, and two-year colleges. I interviewed for this book, we interviewed some people working at community colleges. We're now about half of all people in the United States who are in post-secondary education. That's where they start. They're doing research there too. The faculty is increasingly all have PhDs from major research universities. They understand the game. The students are interested, and off they go. So now we get significant contributions from them as well. So can you, yeah. Last couple things I want to say, and then I'll open it up to questions. So the collaboration, coming back to that theme, has been very important. And initially, the boom in collaboration happened through the American university. The American PhDs in STEM around 1960 were 90% white, native-born males. But they, as a demographic group, flatlined. We didn't get significantly more as the demand for more and more PhDs continued to rise. What saved our production was the greater incorporation of American females, not to their total proportion of the population, unfortunately, and also people of color from marginalized groups, and then most importantly, from people born outside the United States. right now, about 40% of all new STEM PhDs awarded in the United States goes to somebody from a different university. This isn't, excuse me, from a different country. This is now happening worldwide. And the connections from that, plus some other things I can go into later, have really driven the exportation of the model and the collaboration on science. The second thing from here, this happened as Europe came back online. A lot of people want to talk only about the Asian boom in science, which is interesting. But it was a European process too. Now, Asia is a third hub for collaborative research. And I'll just say our research on Asia fits the exact same story. They moved to university-based research. They moved away from an Academy of Science, separate research from the university. They moved away from that. They just did everything at a much faster pace. Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China, and others, India, are all moving in the same direction as what's happened. So I don't know, I guess there's one more slide, I think maybe. Yeah, I guess just the end. So what we found then is, of course, money and government's support and big social climate issues, warfare issues, discovery issues, capitalism, all these things go into science, absolutely. But what's made mega science possible from about 1900 on has been the university and supported by the education revolution. We really doubt that without that, that the world's societies would have paid for this much of science straight out. It would have been very difficult. It would have also been very difficult to prepare the number of science and engineers that are needed, because all of these universities are also preparing the next generation of scientists. So lastly, sustainability. How far will this go? And I can talk a little more during the questions about that. The basic conclusion we come to is that this is not going to run out of steam anytime soon. There's still a lot of capacity. There's still a lot of innovation on collaboration that's happening. However, things may shift. For example, Korea, which did exactly the same thing the United States did, but in like 30 years, is now, because of a fast lowering population, has closed some universities. However, their research productivity continues to grow. So we'll see how, exactly how long this will continue. I think it's going to morph more than just all of a sudden come to a halt. So, well, thanks for your attention. I'll stop there and take any questions, and Alex and Jacob can help me field questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baker. Yes, open it up to the floor. I have plenty of questions, but let's make time for the participants. Julie, yeah.
Dr. Baker, thank you so much for being with us today. And I found this really fascinating. So I'm just kind of curious in the work that you talked about and looking at across, the journals and the increase. What are your thoughts on, I know there's a lot of, at least in my field, there's controversy on open access and publication fees. And so I'm just kind of curious if you've also looked at that in some of this work, or what your thoughts are on that.
Sure, and let's open it up to all the evil stuff, predator journals, schemes to get more citations, the whole thing. Okay, well, first of all, as a sociologist, I have to say deviance always reflects the norm. In other words, as this gets more and more important, you're going to find more and more people trying to cut through the system, right? You don't risk deviant behavior in an area that's not important anymore. So we can kind of flip it around. Yes, those things definitely happen. We don't know in our data that's we have a bird's eye view of the entire world. We don't know exactly how much of that might be responsible for some of the growth, but I find it hard to believe that it's responsible for very much. It's kind of like one of the stories about, it's actually a bit racist. One of the arguments that people make about Asian scientists is that there's all these, they get paid to do extra studies, or they get paid by different journals. And in other words, they're not quite playing by the rules is kind of the argument. And some of their universities are doing those things. And by the way, some of that spreads worldwide. But that's not the real reason they came online so strongly. It's the exact same process. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the open access, however, is, and the speed at which some disciplines, and our social sciences are way behind in this, the speed at which they're publishing is impressive. And it's because of the pressure of how much there is to publish. We also don't think we find much indication of junk science. In other words, people just publish any old thing. The amount of high-cited, high-quality journal type publications have gone up right along with everything else. So I think the whole process is greatly expanded. I also think it's going to be tougher to do those things, those corrupted things. I think the amount of indicators that the average scholar has on them for publications, it's this much now. By the middle of the next generation is going to be this much. It's going to be very hard to do that. But yeah, thanks. That's a very interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a quick question to Dr. Baker. Excellent presentation. Absolutely love the historical development in terms of the publications and which institutions were more prolific than others in terms of regions, so on and so forth. One of the graphs that I found very intriguing was where, 1900, where you had all those German institutions, and then there was the other institutions, right? And so I just started thinking about the Lawrence and the Sheffield scientific schools, right?
Sure.
The Chandler scientific schools, because in the late 1800s, those were the ones that were producing much of the research within the United States. And if we particularly look at Sheffield, they're the first to award the PhD in the United States, 1963, I believe, something like that.
In the United States?
Yeah, the Sheffield. I mean, even though Yale is the one that's credited.
Oh, yeah.
The
Before
Sheffield,
1963, though.
yeah, I'm sorry, 1860, 1863,
Yeah.
And so I'm sorry, yeah, I was off by 100 years on that one. But
It's okay.
you're looking at the scientific schools and
Right.
the science that was occurring there within Harvard and Dartmouth, Yale, and other institutions, right? Did any of those come out in terms of that type of institutions when I looked at that name?
Yeah, there were lots of different trails to the same place across American. I always tease the historians of American higher education. I know you got to tell almost one institution at a time, and they do. But as a sociologist, I'm always looking for patterns, right? In the book, we also cover the land grants. How did they go from these farmer schools to become these multiple complex universities? Yeah, and so there's a lot of stories, but also part of the story, and if you're a historian, it sounds like it, that that a lot of American scientists ended up in the late 19th century trained at German universities, at least getting some of their training. So they saw the Humboldtian model in action, and they came back and they really wanted to set it up. And there were already things flowing from the US to Germany earlier and so forth. But yeah, what we see over the century is what organizational sociologists call an isomorphism of form. In other words, even though Texas Tech and Penn State started in very different ways, you look at them today, they're very similar. They have all the same institutional package, particularly around science. And you can go to any major Asian university and et cetera, and you're going to find very similar kinds of things. Yeah, we're not trying to rewrite the history. We're trying to kind of write what are the big patterns here. The other thing that's interesting, and it's a big thing in the United States, is the state wasn't pushing this, right? In Germany, the state was involved, the empire was involved in saying which universities could do what, although not completely. And the state really wasn't hugely involved. By the state, I mean the federal government. Okay, of course, like Texas Tech, I'm sure there's a whole interesting interactive history between how it went from a small technical college to what it is today. Lots of politics, lots of villains, lots of heroes, interactions with the state, Texas and so forth. But what we find is, even though the paths are different, very quickly, they all aspire to the same thing and do the same thing. Thanks for your question. It's a good perspective.
Levi, you want to ask your question that you put in the chat?
Oh, I could look at the
I
chat.
don't know if my mic is working. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, it's working.
Cool. Awesome. So Dr. Baker, it was really fascinating to kind of follow along with your description of the how. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about your observations or impressions about, like, at what point does this all get oversaturated, or should we be concerned? Like, you kind of predicted that the growth wasn't going to slow. So I'd be curious, is that a good thing?
Yeah, I always get asked this, and it's a hard question for a sociologist. As sort of a scientist, where you kind of try to keep that separate. As a citizen, we obviously all know that there have been some bad things out of science, very clearly. And there's also been a lot of great, wonderful things out of science. And then what a lot of people don't realize is just a lot of neutral stuff. I don't mean the discoveries are neutral. I mean, they don't have a big effect one way or the other in how we live, at least yet. But I do think, and this has been an age-old question in sociology, what happens as society gets more rationalized? And science is certainly a big part of that rationalization. Other kinds of things get pushed aside and devalued. We can even see some people are talking about a reaction to a rationalized society that we see right now in a number of countries, including the United States, where the anti-expert push and some of the liberal kind of populist arguments. Certainly the strange scientific debates we've had about climate change. I'm not saying that the world's going anti-science by any means, but I think people do try to grapple with this. I do think it's disruptive. When your idea about the world in any particular area can change in one opening of a journal, or more likely somebody's written about it in the New York Times. So yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see. But if it's good or bad, it's going to be more. Others?
Yeah, I have a question if I can ask one.
Sure.
So I thought earlier in the talk, you showed a slide about increasing global parity in STEM productivity. And what was interesting about that to me was that I think the European countries and the US were declining over time, and then others were rising over time.
Right.
And I would expect everyone to rise over time. Why is there a decline at all?
So the pie continues to grow. All right. You got to keep that in mind. Right. And it's a little hard to capture that in one graph, but the total number of papers explodes over this time. So there's much more contributing from all parts of the world. So in the middle part of the century, yeah, the US was by far producing most of the papers, or were on, US scientists were on most of the papers. But that's changed, right? So, you know, as of 2010, Germany was the third most, producing the third most papers. And when I say this, when I say Germany or US produces or China, it's increasingly hard to say that. That's another thing we talk about in the book, that the media loves to talk about American science, German science. Well, as I showed you in that Ice Cube project, right, there is no such thing. I mean, it's people working all over. You know, what's Penn State science? Well, I work with you, Alec. I mean, what's that? I mean, you know, what's Texas Tech science? You know, it just blows up, you know, globally. So it gets kind of hard to even talk about that. But so what's happening is that as the world has gone to over 1 million papers a year, it's just more scientists from more countries are involved. And so that's what I mean by parity in an expanding system. Does that help clarify?
That doesn't mean that there are scientists or others that are leaving Europe and the US. It means that overall the pie, you mentioned the pie is growing, the pot is growing,
Yeah.
so the share of that is increasing overall.
Yeah, I just saw the 2019 numbers are in, and China did produce slightly more. There were more Chinese based scientists on papers than American-based scientists on papers, although it's very close. And that will continue to happen. But we shouldn't run around and say the sky's falling for American science. That's ridiculous. It's not. And the growth in cross collaborations right now, we estimate that about 1/4 of all of the world papers include at least 2 scientists working in 2 different countries. And that's amazing when you think about it. And that was not the case in 1980, or it's certainly not the case in 1930. And I think we all can see in our own disciplines the ways in which this can happen. What that means is that both quality of science goes up. Yes, I think in general, this is not always how people have thought about it. Collaboration usually elevates the capacity to do better science and more science. It's a multiplier effect. And so, and given that universities are so similar and the logic behind them, we're not talking about 2 private companies working across 2 places, or God forbid, 2 governments working across places. We're talking about people in very similar institutions. So when you look at collaboration among scientists, you see all kinds of things that you wouldn't predict from geopolitics. You know, Germans working with Russians, Americans working with Iranians, Koreans working with Japanese. If you know the history of any of those countries, you know why that sounds strange. It's all done. There's very little barriers to that. Now, if you get into patents and you get into secret military stuff, of course, then you can talk more about one country versus another. But in terms of general science, no, it's really not the best way to think about it, but people want to, so we had to put in, we wanted to say, this is what's going on. Yeah, but it's not people leaving. No, it's not a decline. No.
Edmund.
I see Edmund's hand, but I may not see everybody's.
Hi, my name is Edmund Gable. I'm in Oakland, California. Thank you, Dr. Baker, for a wonderful, truly wonderful presentation. I really appreciated your thoughts on the role and the continuing role of the university in research and its explosion, if you will, which we've all experienced. I'm interested in whether your research has also looked at disaggregating the role of private sector researchers pardon me, researchers funded by corporations such as Google or others who might be contributing to some of the papers and whether you've had a chance to look at the data in the same way that you look to see if there were university-based researchers involved.
Yeah, there are. So one of the biggest growing areas in collaboration is with the university-based scientists and then a scientist based outside the university. And that could be everything from like an NIH standalone institutes as well as companies. So that's grown like crazy all over the world. We made a conscious decision not to focus on all of the private sources of research. So not long after poor Professor Price made his bad prediction, there was another group of folks, many of them from the UK, that tried to argue that science was moving from what they called a mode 1 to a mode 2. And they said two things about mode 2. One, that science was going to move away from the university. And secondly, that more organizations were going to be involved. Well, they were right on the latter. They were dead wrong on the first. The university has not receded at all, as you can see from what we've shown. But they were right on the second, that more and more different types of non-university organizations have gotten in the game. I would argue it would take some evidence to test this hypothesis. I would say that they reverberate with the university style. Google, in many ways, except for the profit seeking, is very much organized like a university and thinks like one in some ways. So we also did a historical comparison between the very famous, prestigious standalone institutes in Germany, the Max Plancks, if you know of those, versus the universities. And while they're very successful, the universities still produce 3/4 of all of the third most producing country in the world, even though that they have not been treated very well compared to the institute. So what we're talking about is a very robust model. But I think what happens is there's so much rush to catch the new glittery stuff of like, oh, Google's doing research, or that it's often not done with clear knowledge of what the main platform is, and that's the university. So, but definitely worth some more books on that. I don't know if I'll do them, but somebody will.
Well, Dr. Baker, thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with us. And I really appreciate you all on the call for being so engaging. This was fantastic. So this video will be available on our YouTube channel and posted to our website. We'll also be tweeting about it. And just want to remind everyone before you head out that our last brown bag of the semester will be on December 8th on Wednesday from 12 to 1. So looking forward to seeing you there. Thanks again, Dr. Baker, and everyone else.
Thanks.
Hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.